Welcome, everyone, to CDO's magazine series of one-on-one interviews with CDOs, data leaders, and key influencers. I'm your host, Robert Lutton, Vice President, Sandal Consultants. I'm coming to you today from Toronto, Canada, working with the CDO magazine. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Sid Dutta, who is the CEO and founder of Privaclave. As we move to the data protection strategies, from your perspective, how do you see how organizations could possibly shift from a reactive to a proactive approach in preventing data breaches? And so from your point of view, what are the fundamental elements that should be included in a comprehensive data protection and privacy program?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question because you're right. I mean, there's a lot of focus right now is on the reactive part because enterprises are struggling with the detection and the response and the recovery aspect. As they're being attacked. So there's not enough time to essentially do things from a proactive perspective because there's hardly enough bandwidth, and as they're always being bombarded with these advanced persistent threats, every company is kind of on that reactive mode. But if you were to kind of have a program that takes a more proactive approach towards data protection, I think there are few fundamental and broad categories, and of course the devil is in the detail with each of them. And obviously, and not in any particular sequence or order. You need to know your data, right? Because that's like some of the companies actually do a very good job in application inventory management and essentially the lineage aspect and what talks to what, and where these data stores are, and at the end of the day, what data is being actually stored. And
Yeah.
as these DSPM tools that companies are essentially using, as I told you, it's a struggle to kind of go across all of these data stores and start inventorying. But it's also a problem with the point in time aspect of it, because particularly with unstructured data sources, you go and scan, let's say, 1,000 S3 buckets.
Right.
And the very next day, there are 200 more buckets that have been created, or in those individual buckets, there are additional 50 files that have been dropped. So by your scanning and inventorying, it's always a very point in time, and then you gotta like go back and rescan, but then you have so much to cover, just like going back to rescan all of those stuff is challenging. But at the end of the day, knowing your data, understanding it on a regular or a continuous basis. So it's not really a one-time project that you discover, classify,
Sure.
inventory, and then you are done and call it a day. And then once you've established that what data you have, where your data is, then the next point comes is like, who has access to the data, right? So that's one of the fundamental challenges that enterprises have in terms of managing their access appropriately. And in a lot of cases, it's like when you see that there are like too many people who have access to the data, you would hardly hear business coming back and saying, "Oh, these 10 people don't need to see the data." It's always about the business function, and
Yeah.
it's a very big challenge to essentially have a very clear cut demarcation of who needs to see the data and who doesn't need to. So that's one of the challenges, and particularly when it comes to who makes the decision of granting access to individuals, to any data store. Typically, you would want the data owner or the data steward, who needs to make that decision. But establishing that data ownership is a big challenge, and particularly for data stores which are kind of shared and everybody is dumping into for different purposes. And it's a big data warehouse, and there is a couple IT people or security people who are essentially responsible for that data store from an availability and other perspective. They end up granting access to people. And I've had a very personal example. I had my team basically go and raise a request for a data store that was basically a dumping ground and contained millions and millions of personal information.
Wow.
And they raised the request and got approved.
Wow.
And in
Wow.
fact, my team had no business in order to go and have access to that data, because all we were trying to essentially analyze the situation, that at the end of the day, who approves it and what's the process. Because I was hoping that it would get denied, but it didn't. So that's very, very common scenario where
Right.
anybody can just go and have access, and then the decision maker who grants it, I mean, he's like one person, an IT person who's just responsible for the infrastructure. So establishing that ownership is a big issue. Now, of course, when you are able to manage the access, properly, the risks, associated with that needs to be, continuously assessed and communicated to the stakeholders. The other aspect is, do you have sufficient protection on that data? Because in a lot of cases, if you find there's a lot of PII or sensitive information, and then it gets to the point of what security controls, do I have in place? And then basically, how do I manage this? And given that, it's so much, and then you can't really implement all of the controls unless, you're impacting some of the business functionality or usability of that data. So the approach needs to be taken, from the aspect of a risk-based, a framework that protect what matters most. Obviously, you won't be able to protect everything, but focus, your
Focus on the core
uh,
stuff. Yeah.
on the core stuff and the crown jewels, and there is something called too much security, right? So people don't discuss openly, but yeah, there's something that when we overdo or over engineer stuff, but at the end of the day, given that there's so much to tackle and so little resources and budget and time, obviously you have to focus on what matters most, and then try to kind of protect the ones that are radioactive at this point.
Well, you've given a great kind of a list there of actions that an organization needs to go into, but you just touched upon something that I'm sure is a struggle for many organizations. How does the enterprise balance the need for data accessibility, which you just mentioned, versus the stringent need for data protection measures? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think that's always a tough problem, right? And particularly, and I've been on both sides,
Right.
being on the business side and also be on the security practitioner side, and vendor, of course. And it's kind of like
Sure.
a three-dimensional role that, and the challenges are very real. So one of the things that we've tried to follow, one is of course trying to ensure that we focus mostly on the protect surfaces rather than the attack surfaces. And I think that's also something John Kinderwag, on the zero trust side, implies about putting your focus on the protect surfaces, because that's what the attackers are essentially going after, the data in this context.
Sure.
And those are the ones that you try to narrow down your guardrails, because everything else are the various attack surfaces that lead to those protect surfaces. And there are like so many controls that you can put across those attack surfaces, but it just takes one glitch
Mm.
or an oversight for data breaches to happen. But I think to start with, when it comes to balancing or striking the right balance between security and usability of data. Firstly, I think understanding of the data with a proper data taxonomy. So what I've done in a couple of places is essentially we segmented the data and then got to further categorization of the data and eventually to classification. So in that case, where you're trying to get to is these buckets of risk and sensitivity perspective. So sometimes you'll find data classification levels of restricted, confidential, internal, public,
Sure.
and then of course your focus goes onto those restricted classification levels first. So that in that way you're narrowing down the area where you would probably elevate your security controls and put more stringent controls in, while some of the others like internal and public essentially is business as usual. Now, of course, when it comes to applying the security controls that are more stringent, particularly for those restricted data stores, obviously the technology has come a long way, even though some that are still as being labeled as privacy enhancing technologies or PETs, those are still not enterprise grade from a scale and performance perspective, where it would allow business functions to operate as is, even though you have the data protected. But in a lot of cases, you have the ability to have compute being done, in an encrypted mode and very securely, and then there's no chance of data leakage, even though there's multiple party being in a collaboration mode. Other cases, you have a little bit more practical security measures, even admin tasks, format preserving encryption, FFX or FPE has the ability or tokenization and cryptographic on and cryptographic to preserve the analytical, capabilities of the data, the referential integrity between the data points, that you could run your workloads on obfuscated data, without impacting your business functionalities, because at that point of time, you're operating on data that's not the real data. But that's also a kind of an art more than the science. As I said, protect what matters. That you have to be very careful about, what data points you're tokenizing or obfuscating. The other areas would be like where the usability sometimes, comes into concern when you're trying to tightening the security controls, particularly with, more granular access-based controls, whether it's RBAC or ABAC or CBAC, but the continuous validation of the user access, which, as part of the zero trust principle, is that at the end of the day, you don't really trust anyone who's accessing it, whether, it's internal to the network or external. And you're continuously, verifying, their access request. And only after that, you're trusting. That's kind of the underlying part. It's not a trust but verify, but, verify first and then trust. So those are some of the things that has to be dialed a little bit because the business has to be part of that conversation. You can really inject, these stringent controls, in bulk and across the space. And I think there has to be a little bit of that dialing up, as business gets, more comfortable with that. Because a lot of cases, it just requires that ability to be in practice and that process to be in place, for business to get, comfortable. So I think it's a little bit of an iterative and a gradual dialing up of the controls, that would essentially make a lot of sense in terms of how we are striking the right balance, between the usability of the data and the stringent security controls that we are focusing on, particularly on those high risk areas.
And it can be done. The bottom line is it can be done. People
It
are
can be
doing
done.
it and things like that.
Yes.
So, Sid, great input on behalf of the CDO magazine. We really appreciate the time, the discussion in depth, and also your knowledge. We certainly hope that we'll have a chance to have you come back, share your knowledge and experience on cybersecurity, data protection, data privacy, and generative AI. So, thank you indeed for your time today, Sid.
Oh, it was a pleasure talking to you, Robert, and thank you for having me. And I think I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm looking forward to having many more.
Indeed. And for our listeners, please visit cdomagazine.tech for additional interviews. Thank you.